How do you define productivity? That's a tricky one.
Cal Newport is a New York Times best-selling author.
If you interrupt work, it's going to make you fatigue.
Are there people that are inherently good at multitasking, or is that complete BS?
We fool ourselves. The human body can't do that. But I think the people who think they're good at it, they're just used to doing things basically at a mediocre level.
Remote work, remote jobs,
Working from home.
You're working, quote unquote, from home. You want, if possible, for where you work to not be in your home. You're trying to work in a cognitive environment. The thing that you need to fix, it's the laundry basket that reminds you that you have to do laundry. It's a minefield of distraction.
OpenAI, their new technology.
Do you think there is a world where AI gets involved that will unlock something new that we haven't seen before?
I think the future of AI is...
Cal, so great to have you on the show.
Oh, Kevin, I've been looking forward to this. It's good to meet you at last.
I've read your work extensively. I think that your mission and what you talk about and what you preach is like so important and so essential. I certainly feel it personally. It resonates with me deeply because I struggle with a lot of the things that you are talking about in your new book, Slow Productivity. I'm glad to have you here so we can go through it.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for saying that. It means a lot. I'm excited to dig in.
You know, I've been a startup entrepreneur for so long. This weird thing where as an entrepreneur, you never think that you're doing enough. And even after I hand the startup off to someone else and I try to be quiet, I try to be still for a bit. And I think that's why meditation is a big part of my life, because if I didn't have that, how else could I slow down? And there's this like little background process that's in my brain that says, we must do more. You must do more. Like you just have to keep going, keep going. You know, we have this whole hustle culture that started here a while ago. And so to see this book come out, this is a true story. You guys were kind enough to send me a copy of the book, but I actually put it on Audible and I downloaded it a couple days ago and I didn't stop. Like I jammed through it because it resonated with me so deeply. So I guess a great place to start, rather than turn this into a therapy session where you just like help me with my life problems. How do you define productivity? Like that's a tricky one.
Well, I think that's the problem, right? I mean, in some sense, the problem where we start, the issues that are addressed in the book, comes from exactly that question. How do we define productivity? This was a silent crisis in the knowledge sector. So the way I think about it is that when the knowledge sector became a real, actual economic sector with some economic might, this would have been in the mid 20th centuries, more or less, there was this crisis, which was there was definitions of productivity that we had since Adam Smith that were very quantitative and really clear, right? It was output produced per unit of input that goes into the system. And typically there's a well-defined production system that mediates between those two. So if you're a farmer in like the 17th century, right, you're thinking I'm producing this many bushels of wheat per acre of land cultivated. Here is how I'm cultivating my land. If I try now the Norfolk 4-row system and that number goes up, this is a better way to do my land. Yes. Industrial manufacturing comes along, this fits perfectly. This many Model Ts are being produced per paid labor hour, for example. I changed my production system from the craft system to the continuous motion assembly line. That number, which by the way, Ford measured, went up by a factor of 10. Okay, this is a better way to build cars. The way that Peter Drucker talks about it is basically the wealth on which the entire modern world was built in the late 19th, early 20th century came out of this thinking. So there's like quantitative looking at production processes to figure out what worked better, created such leaps in production output per input that the surplus wealth is what defined the modern world. A world where we all have electricity, where there's cars, 2 cars per family. Like the wealth of the modern world actually came out of this idea. It's a very powerful idea, but it doesn't work for knowledge work, right? Because in knowledge work, everything's much more ambiguous. So I could be individually working on 7 or 8 different things at the same time. It's different than what the person next to me is working on. Another key factor of knowledge work when it emerges is there's no well-defined production processes. How you organize and manage your own labor is intensely personal in knowledge work. So we sort of coined this term personal productivity. Like how you keep track of stuff, that's none of my business. That's for you to like buy a Stephen Covey book and figure out on your own. So there's no systems to even tweak to see what makes things better. So what I argue happened is in the absence of these hundreds of years long, incredibly powerful quantitative definitions of productivity no longer holding, we fell back to a heuristic that I call pseudo productivity, which said, let's just use visible activity as a crude proxy for useful effort, right? If I see you doing stuff, like come in an office, let's work your 8 hours a day. I want to have eyes on you working. If I see you're doing stuff, it's probably useful stuff. If we need to be more productive, let's work longer. And so visible activity as a proxy for useful effort became this implicit metric for productivity that we sort of just stumbled into because the stuff that worked wasn't applying anymore.
Right. This kind of went away for a hot minute during COVID. And then you see companies like Apple, coming in and saying, hey, you have to return to the office now. Like it's time to quote unquote, get back to work. But that somewhat is backfiring a little bit. Is that not right?
Well, I don't even think it went away during COVID because what happened, I mean, to me, the key inflection point in this story, and, I'm a computer scientist, I'm a technologist, I'm a part of this thing at Georgetown called the Center for Digital Ethics. And my beat for the New Yorker is really technology and how technology affects us. So I'm always seeing everything through the lens of technology. To me, the key inflection point of this story was the front office IT revolution. So we have personal computers that are networked, followed by mobile computing, and then ubiquitous wireless internet. When this enters into knowledge work, I think this is when pseudo productivity begins to falter and really begins to spin off the rails, because now demonstrations of visible activity can happen at this incredibly fine granularity. Because I have email and then I have Slack, right? So I can, how quick am I answering this? How many things am I working on? It's not just I'm in the office and you can see me. It's, okay, I got an answer to this email after 2 minutes, this Slack chat, you're a part of this Slack conversation. Another sort of hidden thing that happened when personal computers were introduced into the front office, the amount of possible work you could be doing exploded. We forget the degree to which in like the 1980s and before, there was a lot more specialization in knowledge work. Typists typed, and there was a travel desk at the company that did travel booking, and you probably had an assistant that handled communications, and everything was much more specialized. After the personal computer, we basically fired most support staff and just said, do all the things yourself. So we had way more work than ever before, and we could show visible activity at a much finer granularity than ever before. So when the pandemic hits, it almost doesn't matter that we're not in the office because we can just visibly demonstrate activity digitally with emails, with Slack, with jumping on Zoom. That's why a lot of people felt that even though they didn't have to go to the office, there was no one looking over their shoulder. In theory, you had this whole dream of sort of like the way, Tim envisioned remote work in 2007 of like, I can do whatever during the day. That dream completely did not come to fruition because every minute of the day you were still having to be answering things, jumping on things, being in calls, being on Zooms, answering Slack meetings. And so all the promised benefits of remote work in some sense didn't come true because of technology plus pseudo productivity.
Amazing. So essentially, and fill in the gaps here and correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially the networked office, the networked front office, it really screwed us over because now all of a sudden I'm old enough now that I remember the days when networking was just coming online, and I was very young, but I could walk into an office. I remember my dad's office, and there was no email, right? And so like you would literally walk to someone else's office and be like, "Hey, question about that thing," right? Like that was the way that you got stuff done. And now it's just like because of the explosion of productivity tools, there's something, a personal anxiety for me is always like, am I on the latest, greatest, best one so I can be the most productive? That's anxiety producing, because you're always having to like hop tools. And then also there's none of this downtime to really think. And especially someone that's more on the creative side, which I've always been on the product side of things, I need that downtime to be able to actually just process things, just let things stew a little bit, let things bake a little bit. And the number of emails I've sent saying, I'm sorry it took me 24 hours to get back to you. It's just thousands, right? That's really kind of screwed up. Am I getting this right? Is that kind of what led to all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a surprise and almost a paradox, right? That the front office IT revolution did not make us more productive. Because the back office IT revolution, yes. Okay, we're going to use computerized databases. We can have just-in-time inventory control systems. I can now electronically connect into the system in which we're trying to get the logistics right for shipping things across the country, putting mini computers, microcomputers, and eventually just servers into the back office, especially in the 70s and 80s, really was a productivity miracle, right? We could do a lot more than we couldn't do before. So we just assumed we'll put computers in the front office, we're going to get the same benefit. And we didn't. And people call this within the sort of tech critical economic circle, sort of the productivity paradox. We didn't see that rise in productivity. And I think it's for all of these reasons that you're talking about. I think part of the problem is in the back office IT revolution, this wasn't a cybernetic setup. It's not people working directly with the machines together. It was much more just a pure digital play. Our information is in a database now instead of in filing cabinets. We can network these two systems so we don't have to mail stuff across the country or fax stuff across the country. But in the front office, you have a human brain interacting with these machines. And I think the productivity software revolution did not factor in the reality of how human brains actually operate. I think that revolution was using a computer processor metaphor when thinking about productivity. So if you're designing a computer processor, like what are the things that matter? You got to keep the instruction pipeline full, right? There's this view in computer processor design, you do not want idle cycles. If like the processor main circuitry has to sit there while you go and retrieve some data, that is a disaster. So you want to fill this pipeline predictively with the stuff you're going to need. And then speed matters. How fast can we do things? So what do we get in productivity software? Well, we want to make sure that it's as quick and low friction as possible to send stuff to people, to get stuff so that you can always have things to work on. And we want the task to go as quick as possible. So like my word processor, I can type faster, I can autocomplete, I can have software help me speed up. But what it didn't take into account, for example, is that the human brain takes a long time to switch from one thing to another. It's not a processor circuitry. So trying to have a huge pipeline of a bunch of things to jump back and forth between, the human brain can't do that. It gets exhausted. It crosses the circuits. We lose our ability to concentrate. We can't work on this other thing if these other things are distracting us. So I think that this fundamental mismatch between the wetware between our ears and the digital tools that we're looking at with our eyes, that fundamental mismatch really created a productivity disaster in the front office.
Yeah, it makes complete sense to me. So I'm absolutely addicted to rucking. That's where you put this weighted backpack on. I'm doing 4 miles probably 5 times a week. I actually saw a rattlesnake eat a lizard the other day. No joke, it was insane. Anyway, at the end of these workouts, as you can imagine, I'm just sweating a ton. It's great cardio, but I need to replenish my electrolytes. But sadly, most of those replacement powders out there, they're just packed with sugar that goes straight to your gut, spikes your glucose. There's nothing good about that. And that's the reason why I use Element. There's no sugar, and it has the science-backed ratio of 1,000 milligrams of sodium, 200 milligrams of potassium, and 60 milligrams of magnesium. Not only no sugar, no coloring, no artificial ingredients, but there's no gluten, no fillers, just no BS. And I gotta say, new product alert, Element has just released Element Sparkling. It's the same zero sugar electrolyte formulation that you know and trust, but now in 16-ounce cans of sparkling water. And right now, Element is offering a free sample pack with any drink mix purchase. That's 8 single-serving packets free with any Element drink mix order. This is a great way to try out all 8 different flavors and see which one you like. The deal is only available through my link. You must go to kevinrose.com/LMNT. And lastly, and this is the best part, it's totally risk-free. So if you don't like it, you can just share it with a salty friend. They'll give you your money back. No questions asked. You have nothing to lose. Huge thanks to Element for sponsoring today's show. So only a handful of apps actually make it onto my iPhone primary home screen, and Copilot is an app that's front and center. It's been there for about 4 years, and I still use it pretty much every day to track my spending, my budgeting. It is my go-to finance app. Now, as we all know, finance tracking can be a laborious process. You have to categorize expense types, but I love that Copilot uses machine learning to automatically categorize these transactions. And for me, the icing on the cake has to be the integrations, because they have full integrations into Amazon and Venmo. So as these transactions come in, they don't just show up as a generic Amazon entry. You can actually see what you're buying and categorize them appropriately. And of course, you can zoom out to see your entire view of your financial life. So for the best app to track your spending, your subscriptions, and your investments, go to kevinrose.com/Copilot on an iPhone or on the Mac to download Copilot and enter the code KevinRose during onboarding for a 2-month free trial. Again, that's kevinrose.com/Copilot and enter the code KevinRose for a 2-month free trial of my favorite personal finance app. One of the things that you said in the book is you said time and space are needed to craft important things. Why is that?
Well, the human brain, it takes a while to focus on something, right? And this is because of cognitive processes. We have to inhibit unrelated semantic neural networks. We have to excite networks that are relevant. Boy, it takes like 15 or 20 minutes even to just feel you can make progress on something hard.
Yes.
And that first 15 to 20 minutes is like, I can't do this. And then after
Right.
15 or 20 minutes, okay, I'm kind of getting into a run. That's because the brain takes a while to focus. So things need time. Also, quality just requires often that we come back to something again and again. Let's try it from this angle. Let's spend a whole afternoon working on it. Craft is relatively slow. The pace of most modern knowledge work is not. It's very fast and staccato.
Yeah, you said focus, it takes some time to get into it. I have this feeling that if I'm presented with a window of time and I know I have a big task to go after, let's just call it, I look at my calendar, I'm like, okay, I have 30 minutes. It's a big task. It's definitely going to take a few hours. I almost don't even want to get started because I know there's that ramp up just to even get in the zone. Then you get like 5 minutes of actual work done and then you're kind of right back at, back into something else. It's like, and especially given someone like me that has a little bit of, well, my wife will definitely tell you that I have ADHD based on our interactions, but like, someone that has that brain, it is especially hard to do that switching. Are there people that are inherently good at task switching and multitasking, or is that just complete BS and we fool ourselves into thinking we're good at it?
We fool ourselves. It's like asking if people are any people good at breathing underwater. No, like the human body can't do that. The human brain, we know how long network switching takes. It can't do it instantaneously. So I think the people who think they're good at it, often what they've done is just made peace with the physiological subjective feeling of my brain is muddled and exhausted and I never actually get in the full cognitive context. They're just used to doing things basically at a mediocre level. But a human brain is a human brain. You need 10, 15, up to 20 minutes to really lock on to something hard. So if you're checking an email inbox or a Slack channel once every 4 or 5 minutes, you are nowhere near your actual full cognitive capacity. You are handicapping your brain in a severe way and don't even realize that you're doing it.
I would say one of the things we've been pushing to doing a lot over the last, call it 10, 15 years, is this hunt for the ultimate productivity tool. There's been this hunt like, oh, this will be the solution for me. This will be the solution for me. I saw that you mentioned, was it 43 folders? Is that right? I always forget the name of that.
That's right. Yep.
In your book. Yeah. Merlin Mann, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So Merlin, he was such a legendary figure back in the day because he was a very early kind of productivity blogger and had like a great system. It was the GTD, getting things done system. And I tried it for a hot minute. And then I was just like, this is too much. I fell away. And since then, I've tried 15 different productivity systems, interconnective backlink note-taking apps, and you name it. But like every 3 to 4 months, I'm just like, enough. It's too much. It's too much. Do you have any sense why that is? Why these things don't stick?
Yeah. Well, I mean, Merlin, first of all, he's an interesting guy. I profiled him actually for the New Yorker a few years ago. I wrote this piece called The Rise and Fall of Getting Things Done. And because what's interesting about Merlin's story, it's exactly what you're talking about. He gets overwhelmed in work. This is like early 2000s tech sector, which again is exactly when the front office IT revolution began making knowledge work intolerable, right? This happens in the early 2000s. He finds GTD. He thinks this is going to save him. He starts this blog, 43 Folders, which is a GTD reference to the tickler file. This gets really popular.
Oh, it was massive back then.
Massively popular. He gets a book deal actually to write about this, and he gets completely disillusioned, right? Because he eventually realizes that this incredibly complex system is not making his working life easier and actually is never going to get him where he wants to get, which is like creating stuff that matters. And so it's this big, essentially drama where he has to give back the book advance. He gives up on writing the book. He shutters 43 Folders and is like, I can't do this anymore. And he leaves that whole world, which became known as productivity prawn. It's leet speak, but PR0N. That whole world was called productivity prawn. And the basic idea there was the right tool, the complex enough, smart enough tool could bring you to a productivity utopia. That if you just had the right tool to organize all your information and work, you could get something that was essentially effortless. Like the tool is like telling you what to do and giving you the right information. This is the whole dream. Right now, I think these Zettelkasten systems are the new hot thing. And there's this whole dream of you're not going to have to think hard. Your system, you offload all your information into a system and you link it up and you're just going to surface these like brilliant ideas, like the system's going to do the work for you. This has never really worked. The reason why this has never worked is it's just not how production happens of good stuff. Like ultimately, there is this really hard step of trying to create ex nihilo value where there was not before, which takes suffering and concentration and complexity and hard work, and it's frustrating. And that's ultimately, what work comes down to. And no system can make that easy.
Do you think there is a world where AI gets involved in the next, call it, 3 to 5 years, and it's not about the perfect tool, quote unquote, but it's more about us just dumping all available information and asking questions of that data that will unlock something new that we haven't seen before?
I think AI could play a big role here. It's going to beyond the pure language model play, right? So I think what that vision you're thinking about, which is really big right now in the sense of we can have the sort of interrogatory relationship to data fueled by a language model. We can like ask questions about our information and the language model can find structure and give us answers. That'll be a minor part at best, I think, at the potential productivity impact of AI. For me, I think where AI could have a huge impact on knowledge work is actually being able to take over these administrative overhead tasks that are currently the sort of productivity kudzu that's making it impossible for us to get things done. Like the big problem with our current moment, they're related, but a core way of thinking about the big problem right now is that we have a lot of things on our plate. Each of these things we're working on generates its own administrative overhead, emails, meetings, like the stuff you need to sort of just keep the project going. That stuff piles up, that administrative overhead piles up, and that's why our days get fragmented with emails and meetings and we can't get to the actual work. If AI could take over more of that administrative overhead, not make the task faster, which is the current play. All right, I have to send this email, but maybe AI will help me write a draft of this email or help me find the information from my information system I need for this email. Not make it faster. Because again, it's the interruptions I care about, not the duration of the tasks, but actually take over these tasks. Actually send and answer the emails for you. Get the information so you don't need a meeting. That's interesting to me, but that's not going to be a language model by itself. I think that play is going to be language models plus other types of models. I think we're a little often, the tech media right now is a little bit too short-sighted, thinking that just prompt engineering for GPT-4 is like the future of how AI is going to be interacting in our life. The future I'm interested in is going to be multifunctional models. Then some interesting stuff could happen.
That feels right to me, because if you're just increasing output, you're just causing more of the same problem. Right? Like if you're just making it more efficient to send emails, now I'm dumping more emails on other people that might have inferior productivity tools and aren't using AI yet. And it's like loading up on their side, right? You're still adding to the issue versus a world where AI discovers that someone is requesting a meeting, 2 bots negotiate a time and it's automatically done and you just don't even have to think about it, right?
Yeah, I had that conversation years ago with the CEO of X.AI. Which was like a very early player in the AI facilitated meeting scheduling. And this was before language models got big and kind of ate this world. And they had this product where you could CC an email address and it was an AI agent that could help you set up your meetings, and it was supposed to process the natural language. And I still remember the CEO saying, oh, that's not the end game. Like the end game is where my AI agent just talks directly to your AI agent and sets up that meeting without us having to send the email in the first place. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that's where interesting things begin to happen. But it's a really hard technical problem. I've been writing about this recently. It's not a problem you can solve by making language models larger or by having more reinforcement-based fine-tuning. It's not a problem you can solve by having bigger training data sets for language models. It requires new models. I think that's where the interesting stuff's going to happen.
Yeah, but there's also just so much nuance there that is almost impossible for AI to capture. You know, before we got started on this call here, you were having issues with your camera, right? And that might push off your next meeting by 15 minutes. How is AI going to be able to know, like, oh, Kevin's really tired today because his daughter's sick at home and he had to stay up late last night? There's 1,000 things that if you had an EA or someone else that you're working with to help you book your things, you have these conversations. Not to say you couldn't have that with AI, but it is a more challenging problem than just 2 bots hashing out a time, you know?
Oh, yeah. Well, okay. So I'll give you here's the storyline about that's interesting to me. To me, this is the most interesting storyline, one of the most interesting storylines in AI, and it's not being talked about that much. And this is what Noam Brown has been up to, right? So Noam Brown, who was at Meta, got hired away by OpenAI, right? And I wrote this big article a couple months ago for the New Yorker about this, and I don't think it's being talked about enough. It's like what Noam did, like what brought him to fame in the AI world is that he created the first AI system that could win against professional poker players in no limit Texas Hold'em, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he built built a system that could do this pluribus. What was important about this system is that poker, right, the chips and the cards are part of what matters, but equally important is what the other people believe, which is different than chess or Go. Poker is really a game about not what cards do I have, but what do you believe I have? Like that's what I'm playing, right? So he began working on
the bluffing aspect of it.
The bluffing aspect, right? And the value aspect even, right? So he built this engine, right, that was really simulation based, right? But it was simulating potential mental states of the other players. Okay.
Oh, wow.
So then he goes to Meta and they say, okay, we're going to take on a harder challenge, socially speaking, which is the game diplomacy. And I don't know if you know diplomacy, but like the way that game works is it's like Risk, except the key to diplomacy is at the beginning of every round, you have private one-on-one conversations with every other player. And it's all about these subtle alliances and betrayals, and you double cross and double cross, and you tell the one player, I'm going to pretend to have an alliance with Kevin, and that's going to get his positions out of place in Scandinavia. And then the next round you can come and we'll really be a team and we can take over that territory. It's all a game about negotiation between people. They built the bot Cicero that started beating human players on a web-based diplomacy server, right?
That's so cool.
And here's how they did it, is they had a language model, not some super fancy, GPT, Claude model. It was just one of the BERT, one of the off-the-shelf research models with like a couple billion parameters. They had a language model, and then they had a planning engine that, based on what he learned from poker, was simulating the potential mindsets of the other player. And, well, wait a second, what if this person's lying to me? Then what would the implication be if I did this? Would it make sense if they were lying to me? Would that be good for them? So they had a simulation engine that could simulate the minds of the other players and try to figure out, given the different possibilities, what's the best play. And then they had a language model talk to the players. The language model could take what the players were saying and translate it into a sort of XML type format that the planning model could understand. The planning model could then tell the language model, here's what we need to do. We need to get an alliance with this person, put that into diplomacy speak in a way that they'll agree. And the language model talked on behalf. Those two things put together could win at diplomacy. I think email is like winning at diplomacy. I have to simulate the other minds of the other people involved and what do they need here. And if I say this, how's that going to mess up the later part of the plan? And then once you figure out the right thing to do, then you can have a language model say that nicely and professionally and in a way that's not going to annoy people. That to me is the interesting play. And I think that's why it's so critical that OpenAI hired Noam Brown away. And he's probably the head of QStar. I mean, they're pretty secretive about this, but QStar is almost certainly OpenAI's initiative to introduce more planning into their products. So this, I think, is the future of when AI starts to get interesting in the knowledge workspace.
Yeah, that is absolutely fascinating. It's scary on so many levels because, like, 5 years from now, not this cycle, but next election cycle in the United States, you have to imagine that given everything that you just said about the diplomacy side of things, there's going to be some bot that will be able to have conversations and simulate your responses to certain things and try and convince you or sway you in certain beliefs.
Yes.
Right? That's just insanity. And probably be pretty damn good at it too.
Yeah. I mean, one of the examples I give is if you think about HAL 9000 from 2001.
Yeah.
Right. And, it won't open the pod bay doors because it doesn't want Dave to deactivate it because it's focused on its mission, like classic scary AI. GPT can never do that because it can't simulate the future and try to, but a Cicero could. Like for HAL 9000 to know not to open the pod bay doors is because he's simulating. Well, what would happen if I open the pod bay doors? Why might Dave want me to open the pod bay doors? Oh, he might want to turn me off. And that would be, he would get access to my chips. Okay, I don't want to do that. Yeah, it's the planning stuff. I think the future of AI is, first of all, language models are going to severely contract. I think this notion of let's try to have emergent reasoning capabilities as a side effect of making language models massive is an incredibly inefficient way of trying to do that. Like, let's let language models do language, and then you build explicit reasoning models to do the reasoning you want to do. I mean, Noam Brown found this with poker. They tried to build a huge neural network to just learn poker and figure out how to play. And it was huge. And they needed supercomputers to run it. And then when they had an explicit planning engine, they were able to just contract the neural network part to something that could run on their laptop. Like, it's incredibly inefficient to try to implicitly learn reasoning emergently in a feed-forward neural network. Like, let's explicit planning models plus language, emergent language recognition and generation ability. I think this is what the future is going to look like.
Interesting. So you see this as, is that more just siloed models at that point? Individual models that are quite good at one thing?
Yes. And I think language models, we need language models to be good at understanding language, translating it into a format that other siloed models understand, and then taking what those other siloed models come up with and turning it back into whatever appropriate language we need to talk to people. I think that's a much more efficient future.
Yeah.
I also think it's a better way of dealing with a lot of trust in AI issues.
Yes.
I'm a big believer, I call it intentional AI, like little I, capital A, capital I. Intentional AI, if you have an explicit reasoning model to do this and an explicit other model to do this, there's no XAI problem. I programmed this reasoning model, right? I can tell you like how it thinks about things, and separating that from the amorphous, hard to understand logic of recognizing and generating language, I think it makes it much easier. So it's no longer this guessing game of, I don't know, we fine-tuned a trillion parameter language model and I don't know what's going to happen. They don't have this problem with Cicero. Like Cicero, they hand coded, I mean, the engine that makes decisions, like they taught it, for example, we're not going to lie. So when Cicero plays diplomacy, it plays a clean version where it doesn't do deception. It understands the other players might be able to do it. It doesn't do deception. They could just make that choice because they had an explicit engine for actually doing the simulation of game strategy. So I don't think that all of AI needs to be as black box or obfuscated as it is in language models. And as we separate out different reasoning in the different models, we can actually be accountable for what we're programming. We can point to, this is the way that, I mean, I think that's going to be maybe the future. IAI might be the way forward to more trust in AI.
That feels right to me, because at that point, at least it's like, I think of it as almost like a choose your own adventure. Like you can say, well, I'm already seeing this. Like with ChatGPT, I can go and enable very specific models that are just for medical research, right? There's one called Consensus. It's quite good. It crawls all the papers. It has a better understanding than ChatGPT. And when I enable that, GPT hands that off to that model, and I get back better results from that. That has a deeper corpus of peer-reviewed documents that I can look through, right?
Yep.
And so if you could have, it's almost like the app structure in that you have like all these different, on an iPhone, like we have all these different siloed, experts, and you pool them together and you can say, hey, if I got a comment about, I call it the bad Thanksgiving conversations, which are politics and religion. Like if I get something bad back from my AI, it's because I enabled a certain module to give me that information back. There's certain things that I think we just need to say, it's always going to have some bias if you go broad. And so let's go niche. And if you want to be able to pick and choose your political adventure and have that incorporated in your AI, like so be it, but it's on your own watch, not the fact that we tried to solve all of world's problems with one generalized intelligence. Well, if that makes sense.
I think that completely makes sense. I mean, I think what we're seeing in the research community is the number of parameters you need to understand English grammar, to understand what people are saying, and to sort of generate reasonable text back. It's, tens of billions at most. Tens of billions of parameters plus the specialty, whatever it is, niche information, medical information, whatever that you want a niche model to learn is very effective. So I can now, if I have enough data about the niche topic, the 20 billion of parameters dedicated to language means I can answer questions about it or talk about it. But I think there's a bigger issue here as well. And, I had this discussion, I think it was with Scott Galloway on his podcast, where, I think we're a little bit too fixated right now on the current interface we have with something like ChatGPT or Claude, this idea that we send prompts through a text interface and sort of stuff comes back. To me, that's very preliminary. All of the concern we have right now about, is the text coming back when I have chats with a language bot politically appropriate? I think that's going to look like in 2 years. What a weird diversion. Like that our concern was that this digital chat partner is inappropriate, who cares in some sense, right? I mean, it's not like these chat or have some sort of decision function, that these chats we're having through these text interfaces are the basis on which loans are being distributed or whatever. I think this phase, I mean, we forget ChatGPT was a demo. It was invented as a demo to show the possibilities for the underlying language model. This idea of these chat interfaces, that's not the future of these models. These models are going to be much more integrated into other types of systems. They're going to be much more specialized. Their use will be much more specialized. I told Scott, for example, I don't think it matters that you learned how to do prompt engineering. Doing prompt engineering today is like in the early days of Apple II, where they're like, you have to learn BASIC or you're never going to get any functionality out of your computer. It's like, no, the computer evolved, or you didn't have to write your own programs anymore. I think we haven't seen yet the forms in which this type of AI, generative AI, is going to be used, but it's not going to be, almost certainly not going to be just us just talking through a chat interface. It's going to be integrated into systems. Something else will be prompting it on your behalf. Anyway, so I think where it's a little narrow right now, that the fact that a company like Google, like their stock price can take like a huge hit because of the complexities of trying to make sure that this chat demo is, the things it says is appropriate. 5 years from now, that's not what we're going to be using these things. We don't want to, conversations over instant messenger with robots is not the end game here. It's this intelligence being integrated into other things we're already doing.
Yeah, I think it's because people just want to believe it's becoming sentient, and they want to know which way it's politically leaning and all of this other stuff. It is a huge distraction. And I agree with you on the prompt engineering side. I was having a conversation with a buddy of mine that creating a startup about, helping people create better graphics and abstracting away the difficult prompting of creating high quality graphics outputs with AI. And one of the things that you have to look at is when you're doing prompt engineering now, it's like a series of keywords, that are just like, you have to learn the code. Like you said, it's like learning a programming language. And the future, and this is like, it has to be less than 5 years out. Yeah. It's going to be looking at an image and saying, I like what you did there, but that arm looks a little bit weird. Can you twist it a tiny bit? Like call it like 10 to 15 degrees and give me a new output. Yeah. That will be what you say to it. Not like arm 1960s, like all the things that you do that are so weird and just like keywordy. It's going to be a lot more natural language, I think, in the future, and a dialogue back and forth versus structured text that you have to learn. All right. If you watch this show or you've seen me on The Random Show with Tim Ferriss, you know I love to talk about all things finance. I'm always looking for better ways to be smarter about this. One crucial thing that I've learned along the way is that you absolutely don't want anything that chips away at your returns, like the percentages that many certified financial planners take when you work with them. They oftentimes take a percentage of your net worth. You don't realize how much this adds up. Over the years, it could be thousands and thousands of dollars extracted directly from your wallet. Do not do this. If you hear nothing else from this, please do not let them take a percentage of your assets. That's why I love my sponsor for today's episode, Facet. Facet is cool because they don't charge you a percentage. They just have this affordable membership fee that gives you access to a team of certified financial planners. They also help with retirement planning, tax strategy, estate planning, and more. Facet is building the future of financial planning, making professional, high-quality financial advice accessible to the masses, not just the rich. You don't need some crazy minimum to work with them. And here's the coolest thing. There are no product sales. No one's trying to sell you anything. Once you're in the family, there's no commissions, there's no conflicts. It's always a CFP professional, always a fiduciary, and it's just, again, an affordable membership fee that doesn't eat away at your gains. For listeners of this show, Facet is waiving their $250 enrollment fee for new annual members for a limited time. You have to head on over to facet.com. That's facet.com/Kevin Rose. Please use that URL. It really helps out the show. All right, just a quick plug for my newsletter. I really don't like email. And so for me, a newsletter is only once a month. I cannot send you any more emails than that. It would drive me crazy if I was on the receiving side of that. So my once a month newsletter is just packed with high quality information. This is all the products that I'm checking out, other great clips and YouTube videos that I'm finding across the web. Oftentimes I have friends that are launching new products, so I'll have early beta access to those types of things. Some of the books that I'm reading, some of my favorite podcast clips, movies. You can sign up for this over at kevinrose.com. Join 115,000 other readers. kevinrose.com. You'll find the little newsletter link there and sign up today. I want to get back to the book. This is fun going down the AI route. I could do this for another few hours, but talking about just kind of getting back to the theme of productivity a little bit, you talk about three things, and I might not get these exactly right because these are off the top of my head, but it's three things that you're kind of talking about and promoting in this book are do fewer things, work at a natural pace, and then obsess over quality. Yep. And I'd love for you to just touch on those three things. And then also, that feels very like old school Japanese to me. It seems like we're going back to a time of slowness, which I love, quality over quantity. And that's really fascinating. How did you come up with those three main points for the book?
What I did is I went back and I looked for figures to study who were knowledge workers in the technical sense, that they used their brain to add value to information. But I looked for people from times past or from professions that were very distant from office jobs in the 21st century, because I didn't want to get stuck in the uncanny valley of, well, this job is almost like mine, but it differs in this way, so this doesn't apply. Then I tried to isolate principles from these traditional knowledge workers and then adapt them to the office jobs in the 21st century, right? So I was studying the whole scope, sort of the whole sweep of the human adventure of creating things with their brains. Those three principles came up. All three of those principles are pretty adaptable to 21st century office work, right? So do fewer things. Like, how does that adapt to 21st century office work? It comes back to this administrative overhead problem I was talking about. We say yes to too many things in modern work. So the administrative overhead aggregates past a threshold in which we really can't get anything good done. It's exhausting, it's deranging. All day is in Zoom, nothing gets done. The clear solution there is don't work on so many things at the same time, because you're trying to minimize the administrative overhead you're dealing with at once. So if you work at less things at once, the overall rate at which things are finishing actually goes up, right? So this is not
and did you say like one big thing per day? Is that kind of accurate about what you recommend? Or how do you think about what to work on every day?
I worry more in this part as well about how many things are you just actively working on, whether or not you want to work on it in a given day or not. The things you're actively work on generate overhead. Right. So if I have agreed to work on 10 projects and I'm actively working on 10 projects, whether I want to or not, each day, those 10 projects are generating emails that need answers. Those 10 projects have stakeholders that are saying, hey, when can we jump on a call or get on a Zoom, like to see how things are going? 10 projects worth of that overhead hijacks your day. I can't get anything else done except talk about these projects. If you instead just work on 2 of those projects at a time, you only have 2 projects worth of emails, 2 projects worth of meetings, you can really get through these projects. Like, I can actually put a lot of time into these things and do them well. And then I take 2 more, and then I take 2 more. You'll get through those 10 in a shorter total amount of time, even though you're not actively. So doing fewer things is really about concurrency.
Then there's 2 really tricky things here that I wanted to touch on that I think you were so brilliant to call out. And I think they were very important to share with the listeners here. So when you talk about concurrency and you talk about how many things that you take on in a given period of time, we do say yes to a lot of things. And you talk about this idea that you want to have transparency around your workload. So if you are seen as someone that actually manages their time well, then people will actually respect your time more. And that actually means you can take on less. Am I getting that right? Or can you explain it the way you wrote it in the book?
Yeah, no, you're basically right there, right? Because if you deconstruct, what people are worried about is that their boss wants them to do things right away. And that's their concern, right? And like, so I'll never get away with doing fewer things. Or the way I talk about in the book is you don't even have to say no more often, but just differentiate between these are what I'm actively working on, and these are things I've agreed to, but I'm waiting to work on. So I don't do emails or meetings about the stuff I'm waiting to work on, but I'll let you know when I'm actively working about it. People worry like, no, my boss just wants me to do things right away whenever they have an idea. But if you deconstruct that, what's really going on here is that the problem you're solving for your boss is you're trying to minimize their stress. So something comes into their world that needs to get done. It's an open loop. It's a source of stress in their life until that gets taken care of. If they don't know how you work, you're just kind of like this black box that they email and like you do things and sometimes you forget things. Just telling you to do this thing doesn't relieve their stress. Like, until you finish this, I have to keep track of this. And so they'd rather you just do it as soon as possible because the problem you're solving is getting rid of this stress. If they see instead, sure, here is my publicly available work queue. and it's clearly divided. Like, these are the things I'm actively working on. Here's the sorted list of things I'm waiting to work on. Every time I finish something I'm actively worked on, I take the next thing off of the list and I move it in here. You can see exactly where your project is in the list. I will tell you as soon as it crosses over the being active, I'll be like, hey, I'm working on this now. Call me or email me anytime about this. I'll keep you updated. You've solved their problem a different way. Great. Cal's going to take care of this. I don't have to stress about it. I have 100 other things I care about. In both cases, you're solving their problem. Only in one case, you actually have to do the work right away.
Right. And I love that, because what you're doing from the manager's point of view, how the manager is feeling when you say this, is they feel like you have your shit together.
Yeah.
They're like, okay, this person is going to track it and that ball is not going to get dropped. Yes, it may be 2 weeks out, but at least I know they're tracking it and they're going to give me an update when it crosses into that active list. And one of the things that you said in the book that I thought was brilliant that I'm going to use is you said, okay, you can say to someone that emails you and says, hey, I need this done, blah, blah, blah. And it may be another colleague or something. You can say, hey, I have this queue. I am not yet working on what you just mentioned, but here are the things that I need from you. So when the time comes for me to start work on this, it can be as efficiently done as possible. And so you're actually putting it back on them, getting all of that payload that you need to actually be as efficient as possible when the task does enter your active queue, and letting them know that I take my time seriously. I manage my time. And then everyone is like, oh, okay, this isn't someone that's just slacking off. They have a system. And if they have a system, I can trust them to produce high quality work.
Yeah. And
that's brilliant.
And here's an even advanced twist on that.
Please.
When a colleague, so there's a social dynamic here. So with a colleague, this will be easier than a boss. When they say, hey, can you do this for me? Right. You have your queue. You don't put in the queue. You say, great, I've created a document for this project. When you get a chance, like whenever, I don't want to rush you. Whenever you get a chance, get me the information I need in there. Once I have all the information I need, I'll move this into my queue.
Wow.
So it's not even in your queue, because a lot of times what's happening is people are playing obligation hot potato. This thing is on their plate. It's a source of stress. They're not very organized. By being like, hey, can you do this? Send. They get a temporary relief. It's not on their plate anymore. So it's this asymmetry. It's very easy just to like bounce it over to you, because I'm just trying to reduce my stress in the moment. But when they say like, oh, I actually am going to have to still keep track of this. It's on me to go gather the information and bring it over there before I can get this hot potato onto the other plate. 5 times out of 10, they're just going to let it drop. They're like, I don't know. I have too many other things going on. Maybe it's not so important. And it never gets on your queue in the first place. So that little twist reduces the incoming by 50%.
That's amazing. It's so funny how when we go on vacation and we come back and you look at your inbox and you realize that something's been sitting there for a couple of weeks, how much of it just doesn't even matter anymore? You know what I mean? Like it just somehow gets magically done, or just didn't even need to be done. I do this thing called email bankruptcy every so often, where there's just so much in my inbox where I'm like, I haven't checked it. And like, those are 3 months old. I'm just going to assume if it's important again, they'll email me. And like 9 times out of 10, I just never receive an email back about it again. But I like this idea of rather pushing back and saying like, I needed more information before it even gets onto my queue, which is huge. One question, how do we figure out, what we can commit to, and if there's actually enough time to take on something new?
Something that helps you get a better sense of this is, at least for a while, trying to advance schedule the time to work on things you agree to. Okay, let me just think about this project. How much time is it going to take? Let me go find that time on my calendar and protect it. All right, here's 4 hours here. Here's 2 hours here. I have to find the time for the things I'm going to work on. You don't really have to do this perpetually, but if you do this for a little while, it really does strengthen your pattern recognition capabilities of what is my schedule really like? How much time is this really going to take? Do I have that time? Where is it going to fit in? So it's like training. It's like I want to weight train my pattern recognition for calendar availability. So if you try that for 6 months, I'm going to put stuff on the calendar and then I'll tell the person, yeah, great. I'll do this for you. I've scheduled it already. Here's when I'm working on it. This is the next time I could find the time. You tell them exactly when those days are. You will discover, like when most people try this, they discover that they're like 3x more optimistic about their available time than reality. And things like, oh, I could easily fit this in, turns out 3 or 4 weeks later than I thought is the next time I have time. That the workload that I was leaning towards as reasonable is probably 3 times more projects than I really have room for. So I think even that exercise is a great bit of training.
Yeah, that's great. Can you talk to me about autopilot and how rituals and location can help us out?
Yeah, I mean, autopilot is regular, worked as regular, right? I know that we have to file these reports every month or that the clients need like an update on what happened each week. If the work is regular, figure out when and where you're going to do that work every week and like take that decision out of your daily scheduling, right? It's just on your calendar, it's recurring, it's chosen for a really good time where it's not in the way. Like, oh, I always have this hour between these two standing meetings. That's when I'm always going to do this paperwork. And I do it in the conference room because it's empty until the next meeting comes. So for regularly occurring work, knowing when and where you do that work really simplifies things. And then the other piece here is like your environment does matter if you're doing cognitive work, right? If you study professional writers, this is like a hobby of mine, where professional writers work, they almost always, for example, have a difference between where they do their business and where they write. They'll have really nice home offices where they send stuff to their agents and they have to like email with publicity tours and all the stuff going on, all the business of being an author. And then they'll have, a garden shed where they go to do the actual write, because environment matters. The cognitive cues, environmental cues matter. So caring about, I do certain types of work in certain types of places is just a smart practice if the work you do involves your brain, because the brain does respond to that.
Yeah, I never thought about using location as something that I can. So if I'm not a writer, how might I else apply location to the things that I do? What are some other examples of people using location as part of their workflow?
Well, I think there's two things that come up a lot in knowledge work. One is if you're working, quote unquote, from home. I don't like that phrase. I want it for reasons you'll see, but working remotely, you want, if possible, for where you work to not be in your home. So I don't like the phrase work from home. So if it's just great, I can now just work at my kitchen table. You're trying to work in a cognitive environment that has all of these salient cues that have nothing to do with your work. It's the thing that you need to fix. It's the laundry basket that reminds you that you have to do laundry. It's a minefield of distractions. And so I'm a big proponent of what I call work from near home is the right way to do remote work, which is it is where this should be subsidized by offices, but like whatever you can do to have a space to work that's not your home is going to make a really big difference. And then the other big idea I've really been pushing for is that in professional workspaces, there should be two separate places where deep work is done and administrative overhead is handled. They should be physically separate places, if at all possible, right? There's a place where you concentrate and work. There's a place where you do emails and attend meetings. I think, especially in a future where we have all this commercial real estate and we don't need to have permanent offices for everyone, this is a way to reconfigure it. Like, here's the places you go. We have a bunch of these computer terminals you can log into and do email or this or that. And then here's the quiet places you go to do deep work. Separate those two things.
Yeah, I love that. Do you find that there's a benefit to walking and deep work, or on the contemplation side, where is that best done?
Well, walking seems to be useful, especially for ideation or generating a new insight. It's not exactly sure. We don't really know exactly why this is, but there's speculations that it has something to do neurologically with the walking actually quiet certain circuits. Like, so certain circuits get caught up in the routine rhythmic motion of what's happening with the walking, which actually makes it easier to focus with the frontal cortex on something you're thinking about. So like when you're walking, it's easier to manipulate things abstractly in your mind than if you're just sitting still and trying to do it. So I think walking, that's why we see this, of course, famous thinkers and philosophers throughout history have these massive walking habits. Like that's where they got their thinking done. Nietzsche
and
would
you even
walk.
see like, I mean, it's mostly movie based, but you see like people pacing too, right? Just kind of getting around, like, hand on the chin, kind of walking around, thinking, pondering. There's something about that movement that is just, I don't even know how to, like, I've experienced this a few times myself when these insights come from, it doesn't come from when you're forced to do something. It's like, go be creative. It's like telling a comedian, hey, tell me a funny joke. No, I can't do that on command. Like I need some space here to just almost let it percolate in the subconscious before it makes itself known.
Like this is how I write, for example. The generation of the ideas, the structure in which I'm going to present the ideas, how the pieces fit together, that's all on foot. And then I come in and I sit the focus on my screen for a separate activity, which is the craft of writing. And then that you have to sit for. Because actually to put the final words on paper, you really need all hands on deck, cognitively speaking, because that's a very skilled, difficult, focused task of sentence creation. You have to spend 20 minutes to get into that state of focus. But I can't come up with ideas that way. So, I'm known in my town as sort of the weird white writer professor guy who I just walk and walk like all day long because that's my job in some senses. I have to come up with the ideas. That's the best way to do it.
Yeah. Well, and it's also just insanely healthy for you.
Sure.
Talk about like your mental health and fitness and everything else. Like you should throw on a ruck pack with that and you'd be like good to go. Get 25 pounds on your back while you're doing it.
You're not the first person to tell me that. I think, several people, and they're all in the West Coast. I think this is a Silicon Valley thing, have told me.
Have you ever listened to Dr. Peter Thiel's podcast? He talks about rucking a ton, and he's been my physician for a decade. And there's something really powerful about getting your heart rate up into that zone 2 area, and if you can just put on an extra 25 or 35 pounds, like you can get close to that. It's actually helped me a ton, just, slim my waist up a little bit and just feel better generally.
And I'm assuming walking with a ruck pack is different than like running. Like when you're running, eventually you're kind of exhausted, you're short on breath, and that's like all your brain goes to that.
That's right.
And then it's hard to do anything else. Like I can't think when I row or run, but I assume walking even with that, because I can think when I hike uphill, like walking with extra weight, you get a better benefit, but you can still think.
That's exactly right. Like if I'm on the Peloton cranking out a high intensity interval training, like there's no way in hell I'm getting any thinking done. I'm like, how do I not die from this exercise? Yeah. Awesome. So let's talk about small tasks. These are the things that are, for me, it's death by 1,000 cuts. It's all these little tiny micro things. Oh, there's a DocuSign for here. It's got to be signed today. You've got these incoming emails. This person has a question about this. How in the hell do we get into a place where this is something that doesn't seem like this horrible distraction that just rips apart our day, fragments our brain, and squashes all productivity?
Yeah, I'm surprised that this is not, conversation 1, 2, and 3 when we think about running a productive business. It's like everything. These small, urgent distractions that make it impossible to think. I don't know why we don't fear these and talk about these all the time. I mean, to me, it's like I'm running a car factory and there's like the electricity keeps going out and like the assembly line keeps stopping and it's like completely reducing the flow massively of which cars are being built, and we're just putting up with it. Like, well, yeah, the electricity system's bad. So, I mean, this is, I think, issues 1, 2, and 3. There's a couple preparation-based things, I should say, that you could do here that stop the task from showing up in the first place. I think we should start there. So working on fewer active things is a key. I was sort of missing this insight in my earlier work, but in this book, I really got into this insight is just having fewer things generating overhead has got to be the first step, right? Going from 10 active things to 2, that makes a difference. All right. Being careful in your choice of projects can make a difference as well. It's an idea from the book that some types of projects are going to generate a huge amount of unscheduled, urgent tasks. Other projects won't. You want to prioritize about reducing those urgent, unscheduled tasks. Not how hard is the project going to be, how difficult am I going to have to think, even how long it's going to take. Forget that. What you should care about is how many unscheduled, urgent tasks is this going to generate. If it's a lot, try to avoid taking on that particular project. Once you actually have the work in your sort of world and you have to deal with it, a big thing to tame becomes actually how the communication and collaboration happens. So a lot of the sort of urgent things that are unscheduled but requires you to deal with tends to be back and forth communication. So if you don't specify, here is how we're going to collaborate on this task to get it done. If you don't specify it, the default will be what I call the hyperactive hive mind, which is we'll rock and roll and figure things out on the fly with emails and Slack, right? Let's just go like, hey, what about this? Did you see this? What do you think about that? We'll just figure things out on back and forth. That collaboration style is a disaster because what happens is everything I'm working on now has these ongoing conversations. I have to tend to them. I can't just batch and say, I will get back to my email in 4 hours because this conversation we're having in email over here is going to have 10 back and forth messages. And we have to get to a conclusion today. We're trying to decide on something for tomorrow. And so I need to see your next message within the next 15 minutes, or we'll never get through everything in time to actually reach a conclusion. So it's this sort of unstructured collaboration that drives us to have to check our inbox all the time, to check Slack all the time. So you can actually just say, once you've reduced the amount of things you're working on and have some breathing room, you can talk to the people you're working with. How are we going to collaborate on this? And you figure it out in advance. You take a little time in advance. You work on this, I'll work on that. I'll put my comments into this shared doc by the end of day on this day. You can look at them and put your revisions by the end of day the next day. And then after this meeting on Thursday, we'll huddle up for 10 minutes and figure out what we want to do next. You just sort of figure out the plan. Here is how this work is going to unfold. So we don't have to rely on just unscheduled back and forth messaging. So you constrain the communication on what remains. That's going to make life so much easier. Those three things together is going to make life so much easier.
There's a lot of devil in the details there, though, because like if you imagine a typical chunk of people that are working on a project, and I'm just thinking software development in my head, let's just say we have 7 or 8 people working on one launch. You're right in that it's going to be Slack, and it's going to be, Slack and email, largely Slack. And there's just a quick back and forth expected, right? Like if you're the one that's read slow productivity and nobody else has on that team, and everybody else is just like used to using Slack as this instant back and forth throughout the day, what can I do to convince my coworkers to take a beat and kind of, move to something that is a more, I don't want to be the odd one out here. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like how do you get people on board?
Well, you don't explicitly try to get them on board. You just sort of say, here's what we're doing. You start doing it. This is one strategy. So you don't give a speech about, let me talk about attention capital and context switching costs, and we need to move away from the hyperactive hive mind. You're just like, all right, team, like we got to get this website updated for the new product launch. Here's the things that need to get done. Here's how I think we should do it. I will do this by the end of this day. You can do this on this day. We'll then meet here. For our final meeting, here are the 5 times that seem to work for everyone. Just put in the doc before we get there, like which the days you're going to do. Okay, let's go. So you're just sort of, I call this process-centric emailing, but you're just sort of laying out what you're going to do and just telling the other people. You're not really explaining the philosophy behind it. So that's one way. The other way is, there's a couple other things you can do. On your own end, something that works really well for things that aren't so regular is just have office hours, right? So here's a set time every day. This is a big sort of Jason Fried Basecamp idea. Set time every day in which I'm always available. My door's open. I have like a Teams meeting open, my phone's on or whatever. You can start deflecting stuff to that. So it's all you're saying to people, if it's not super urgent, yeah, we should get into that. I have office hours every day at this time. Next time it's convenient, just hop over, we'll figure it out, right? So now you're deferring some things, the office hours. And then the third way is at the team level to do talk about this and have better systems. Like software development's interesting because that's already been done. That type of thinking has been done when it comes to the straight up coding, right? This was figured out in the early 2000s. Actually, if we have some sort of agile methodology where we keep track of features separately from individuals, an individual sprint on one feature at a time, and we check in with a daily stand up, like that's an idea for breaking up workload and communication that works much better than, hey, let's all just sort of like rock and roll. Like, can you do this feature? What's going on with that feature? And so like computer programmers have sort of figured this out. They have alternative
It's interesting.
systems.
We never applied that everywhere else, right? Because like you're right, like agile methodology and like these ideas of daily stand-ups, it works, and yet we stopped there. We were never like, hey, we should apply this same thing to other, types of workers in the office. Which
we should. To me, like the core idea behind any sort of Kanban-based system, the core idea that should be relevant to all knowledge workers is centralization of workload. So instead of, we don't realize the degree to which in most knowledge work positions, all the work that needs to be done is haphazardly distributed among individuals. Everyone owns it. Like I own this one, you own that one, and it's all about who emailed who. In Agile and Kanban type systems, all the work that needs to be done is not owned by individuals. It's on a board over here. The whole team owns it. And then individuals work on a small number of things at a time and then pull in something new when they're ready. That one insight can transform any knowledge work group. Of when something needs to be done, I have a place to put it so I don't have to keep track of it, but I also don't have to just obligation hot potato it onto your plate where now it's something that's like generating stress, administrative overhead. So like even that idea of here's the things our team needs to do, here's what each person is currently working on, and we can see it. That idea alone is like a massive improvement. Yeah, I think it's because software has a foot in industrial and a foot in knowledge work. It's knowledge work because it's all done with your brain, but it's industrial because you're producing a product to specs on a timeline. So they're much more willing to do process engineering. Knowledge work is tainted by this big belief in autonomy, this idea that it's up to the individual to figure out how to do their work. It's no one else's business but the individual about how they manage their labor, how they manage their time, how they manage their workload. That's not our business. Our business as a manager is to give them objectives. Here's your KPIs, like hit them. I don't want to know how you're doing it. So we have this sort of barrier between objectives and process. And Peter Drucker, who came up with management by objectives and coined the term knowledge work, this was his big thing. I think we're now paying a price for going too far with this. We don't think in pure knowledge work enough about how the work actually happens.
One of the points that you mentioned in the book, the three major points, is this idea of obsessing over quality. Why is that so important?
Well, if you want to slow down, ultimately you have to do this, right? Like the first ideas, the first principles are about you're doing less things, you're removing something, you're spending more time, you're having more variation in intensity, you're better matching natural rhythms. That's kind of taking things away. You have to balance that out with a commitment to the things you're doing them better. Like I want to do things really well. That's what makes the whole slow productivity mindset not just be, I want to work less, but actually is a sustainable for both the individual and their clients and their employer and the people that they're servicing. But the other thing that happens when you really start to care about craft, slowness no longer seems artificial or unattainable, but instead begins to seem necessary. When I really care about doing something really well, pseudo productivity becomes anathema. My inbox being so full becomes a crisis. My workload having 10 or 15 other projects becomes something that I have to fix. So that mindset of what matters is the quality of what I do best makes slowness, makes the non-busyness seem like by far like the self-evident way that you need to work. So it's sort of the engine that drives the slow productivity mindset.
And there must also be a component that is, satisfaction with your output, just being proud of what you have produced for the world. And when I think about, some of the artisan kind of Japanese masters that I've had the pleasure of visiting, they actually in Japan, they have this designation for like living legends of these craftspeople that are just like producing high quality works. I was in this little tiny town about 2.5 hour ride outside of a train ride outside of Tokyo. And I met one of the living legends that was a woodworker. He had a space that was 3 people working in there. He was in his 80s and, he's hand carving like these beautiful wooden bowls and polishing them. And there was just like this attention to detail and this satisfaction. And one bowl would take him like 3 months to produce, like this little tiny bowl, And I just you can't help but look at that and say, gosh, when you obsess over quality and you really it becomes your life's work, like there's something beautiful and deeply satisfying about that. Like, do you think that's a very important aspect to this, is finding satisfaction in your work is the quality component?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that busyness and pseudo productivity robs us of. So when work becomes all about activity, we have to begin prioritizing activity. I'm moving really quick, I'm answering things. We have to stay away from things that require more long-term focused effort. We get alienated. And I use this phrase. I mean, obviously it's a German concept that comes out of, Marxism, this alienation from labor. Actually, this is a relevant way to think about what's happening with pseudo productivity, is that we get alienated from our ability to produce things that matter. And that really is a state that's psychologically distressing. It's this is me. It's like the Pale King, David Foster Wallace. Just, I'm sitting here moving things back and forth, emails back and forth. I'm going on Zooms, taking notes from the meetings and sending follow-ups and like, what am I actually doing here? Right. That is supremely frustrating. Humans like to see their intentions made manifest concretely in the world. That's a quote from Matt Crawford and Shop Class is Soul Craft. Got to get that right. Where he talks about the pleasures of manual competency. We like to see our intentions made manifest, concretely in the world. we do get great pleasure out of it. So it's part of what makes slow productivity a lot more sustainable. It's not just that you're not overloaded, but you can actually see what you're producing and care about it. I mean, this is the nexus of the argument that I sometimes fall into with more of the anti-work crowd, who's responding to a similar issue, which is this sort of sense of nihilism and exhaustion in work, but they lay the issues entirely at the feet of just capitalist structures. And they don't like when I emphasize this other part of like, well, actually, there's parts of work that are really deeply meaningful to people, and reclaiming that is, you know, not only going to be very sustainable, but it's probably something that is way more approachable than, you know, replacing capitalism. You know, like that building work more about craft and less about busyness is something that could make us much happier and is much more proximate than waiting for the eventual collapse of late stage capitalism or, you know, some revolutionary ideology or utopian vision. So yeah, you're 100% right. Work is more satisfying when we're producing stuff that's good, and we're getting better at doing it, and we're getting recognition that it's good, and people are saying that is a really good bowl. We're wired for that. We eat that up.
Yeah, we eat it up. I bought one of the bowls. I definitely was like, this is too good. Like there's something just like, and then just owning a piece of that when you can see the effort that went into it is just a beautiful thing. I'd like to end on one question for you personally. You know, someone that's been so prolific about writing about, you know, deep work and slow productivity, and, you know, how do you structure your own day? Like, what can you walk me through a day in the life of Cal Newport? Like, what does it look like when from rise to actually calling it a day and going to sleep?
Well, I think you have to start with the question of how do I structure my year? Because a big part of what I do is because I don't like busyness. And I don't like having a ton of things on my calendar. I work only in roughly a 9 to 5 schedule. That's always been my commitment to myself and my family. And so you have to look at how I schedule my year because I sequence, right? I'll work on this during this season, this other thing during that season. So I never want to be working on too much at the same time.
So you're like seasonal working?
Yeah.
Like you do. So you divide up work based on seasons?
Yes. Yeah.
And how do you do that? That doesn't even make sense to me. I don't know how that works.
Well, I mean, partially I'm a college professor, so it's a little bit more natural. But like, for example, you know, this season is I'm very much in like book publicity mode. So I'm not trying to write a book or make a major academic breakthrough. The summers I disappear, right? I'm a college professor. I don't take summer salary from research grants in the summer. I pay my own way and disappear. That's when I do a lot of deep thinking. I do a lot of writing. It's where I work through notions for books. There'll be certain semesters where I say, this is really like an academic semester. I now stack my classes. So there'll be a semester where I'm teaching, doing all my teaching. Like, great. So I can just be locked in on my students and what they need in academic life. And another semester, I might be doing no teaching. It's like, great. I could be working on, I'm writing these papers, and that's what I'm focusing on. I'll write a book, and then after a book, I'll focus for a while on, you know, a bunch of academic papers. Then I'll focus back on a book. So I sequence. But if you zoom out over 5 years or 10 years, a lot of things finish in there. The fundamental attribution error, though, is not to look at the things that I did in the last 10 years and imagine me working on all those things at the same time during those 10 years, because I don't like busyness. I don't like having a lot to do. I like having a lot of breathing room. If I don't get a lot of deep work, I tend to get pretty upset. But what that look like differs by the day. So like in the summer, you know, I take no meetings. I have nothing on my calendar on Mondays or Fridays. And the things that are on my calendars are the afternoons, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursdays. The rest of this time is just like focused deep work. That looks very different in a teaching semester where, okay, I'm not getting long periods of deep work, but what I'm doing is like juggling the plates to like handle my classes and administrative duties really well. So like my day depends on the season, and I change up and down different types of things. I keep varying that.
I love that. The summertime Monday, Friday free must be so nice in terms of just the mental, having the space to get outside, because summertimes are typically beautiful, and just having a little bit more flexibility on that and enjoy the weather for what it is.
Yep.
And then just having the downtime to get creative on those days must just be beautiful. It sounds like a fantastic thing I might steal from you and pick up. One of the things that I had the luxury of working at the Nevada test site for the Department of Energy when I was very young, and we did 4 day work weeks. And I loved it. It was every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday you had off. And I've heard that's starting to pick up again, and that some companies are starting to dabble with that. Speaking of like kind of taking days off, are you a fan of that?
I'm fine with it if you deal with the deeper problems first, right? So if you deal with the problem of workloads, I'm working on too many things concurrently, the administrative overhead is choking me, like you need to solve those problems. If you solve those problems, then you can actually realize, hey, 4 days of work might be enough, or we don't need all 5 days, or we change it seasonally, we have summer hours. What I don't think works is taking a culture where everyone is overworked because they have too much on their plate and the administrative overhead is choking off their time and they're having to work in the mornings and late at night. They go into a culture like that and say, we'll solve this by saying don't work on Friday. You're not really solving the problem because all of those things are still on your plate. All that administrative overhead is still there. I mean, it doesn't make it worse. I mean, this is another sort of Jason Fried case study. Like they experimented with this in the summer and they found that actually people adapted to there being less time and they sort of adapted their workloads. So I don't think it's the worst thing, but I don't want it to be seen as the ultimate solution. I think the ultimate things we need to do are internal. How do we manage our workloads? How much work should people be working on at once? How do we communicate about this work? Do we focus on activity or do we focus on output? You make those changes, you get the really big results. And then you can mess around with things like what days you work, or should we care, or what hybrid schedule or remote, like a lot of that stuff can't solve these problems by itself, but become interesting options once you solve the deeper original problems.
Yeah. You must be friendly with Jason Fried, yeah?
Yeah, we did a book launch event for 2 books ago. Yeah, I know Jason.
That's awesome. Yeah, Jason is one of my favorite humans in terms of just being such a creative thinker when it comes to, how to run a business and reimagine almost every aspect of running a business. I've had the chance to brainstorm with him. We used to be on a board together. So we would like just shoot the shit from time to time. And like his mind and where it goes and the things he dreams up for his employees and the series of experiments, it's just so fun to watch. So fun to watch.
I wish more people were doing, he's a chill guy. So I think most people in the startup culture, I'm assuming, feel like I don't have time or I can't risk doing this. But I'm always surprised there's not more people who have these sort of stable startups like, Basecamp is that aren't being super experimental and like swapping best practices and like just read their manual, which is online. It's just full of interesting ideas. Like cycling is another one. Like we have off cycles and down cycles. I wish there was 100 startups that were equivalently aggressive about experimenting, because imagine all the interesting stuff we'd come up with if we had so much sampling going on out there.
You know what the key was for Jason is that, he never took on venture capital.
Yep. And
so he was never beholden to go and have some massive exit. And so it wasn't like he was shooting to be a multi-billion-dollar company. Now he has a massive business, Basecamp's like a huge tool, as is Hey and the other stuff that he experiments with. But like he kept it all private so he could grow at his own natural organic pace and didn't really have to, had the luxury of being able to say, I don't have to be beholden to these other venture capitalists. I can just go and mix things up whenever I want, which I think is essential.
Do you agree with this? Do you agree with this theory that part of what happens is when you're a small startup, actually you do need to work in a sort of hyperactive, all hands on deck way because there's just too much going on to structure. And then once you're used to that, it's hard to turn off once you get bigger. It's like one of my theories, like venture capitalists are like, I want to see the lights on, but kind of for good reason, because if you're a 4-person startup, you kind of have to just be on Slack all day or in the same room because there's 1,000 things and it's all new. And then my theory is it becomes hard. You then say, this is fundamentally what you need to succeed in a business, but a business that's at 1,000 employees is a completely different beast than 4 employees and 3 weeks in.
Yeah, I mean, it's also really hard. There's different stages of pain. Like pain is because you can manage that type of the general kind of philosophy and ethos within your organization up to about 20, 25 people. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, not everyone can be in the same meeting. And then there's a whole nother set of problems of like, oh, I missed that meeting. Why wasn't I included? Or now I'm not on the same page. And now you're dealing with just broken lines of communication that need to be repaired, and you have to figure out new workarounds. And so, there is some truth to every time you add a new employee, you're actually, starting over again. Like you have a brand new startup, because it grows the team and things break in certain ways. And it's really challenging. But I would say the thing that's tough almost more than anything else is when you get to a size, call it 50 or 75, where you realize that idea of everyone, kind of that team that you had when it was 10 people needs a little bit more structure. And oftentimes people tend to go too hard in that direction, and you lose the creativity.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden you're trying to implement, processes from Google and other big companies, and you become a big company and the innovation kind of suffers because of it, So it is startups are a pain in the ass. I'm done building them. They are so difficult. It is such a there's nonstop fires, which for me is I feel like I'm finally starting to realize that let's just stick to podcasting and doing investments on the side. That sounds like a much better, and hopefully, interview people like you and help other people adopt some of these better practices that are coming to light. Yep. So Cal, it was a pleasure having you on. But before we go, slow productivity, we covered bits and pieces of it sprinkled throughout our conversation today. But for people that are, are like, okay, that was a really interesting conversation, I want to learn more. What can people expect to learn in this book? Like, how would you present it to someone that had never read anything that you've done in the past?
Right. So in the first part of the book, I make that argument about how do we get to where we are today with pseudo productivity and the front office IT revolution and why that spun off the rails. The second part, I give those 3 principles for the slower, more outcome-based philosophy. I really see 2 audiences for the book. They're both served. So entrepreneurs or solopreneurs or freelancers who have a huge amount of autonomy, you're going to get pretty radical ideas in here about how to sort of radically reshape what you do around these principles. And then the other audience are people who work for large companies. And how can you personally change the way that you approach your work and manage your workload and communicate with other people and conceptualize your career to integrate these ideas. So really both audiences are served by the book. But what I hope you come away with is an understanding of what you think of as productivity right now really is broken. And there are alternatives. They're not easy, but they're also not impossible. There's some principles that make sense. And there's a bunch of tactics in there to give you ideas about how you put them into practice.
Yeah, I love this. This is a true story. Last night, when I was going through the book and reading it and finishing up on it, I emailed my assistant, and she's amazing. She's like this ultimate Swiss Army knife, and we're always trying to figure out how to be on the same page about things and like how not to overload calendars and all that stuff. And I'm like, I said, you can expense this. Please go download this book right away. Like, we need to start implementing some of the ideas here because they're non-obvious, but when you hear them, they feel very obvious. It's like, I wouldn't have thought of that on my own, but when I hear it, I'm like, oh my God, this makes a ton of sense. It's funny. Last thing, and I'll let you go, I promise. I had this idea about a decade ago because I always have had an issue with email stacking up. And I wanted to write an email application that, you talk about this, and we didn't really cover this much detail today, but you talk about this idea of push versus pull strategies, which is quite fascinating. And one of the things that I wanted to do in an email client was that when you emailed me, if I had a queue longer than a certain amount of unread emails, you would get an auto response back and it would say, hey, just so you know, Kevin reads about 10 to 15 emails on average. You are currently number 87 in the queue. We expect that he will read your email by this time and date. And if you would like to jump the queue because this is ultra urgent, click this button. And so if you click the button, it would then enable them to jump the queue because they're saying this is super important. Otherwise, then I could just slowly pick away at that list and not feel uncomfortable about it. And I never built it, but it was like this idea. And I was like reading your book and I was like, there's something about somebody needs to build a suite of slow tools. Screw the modern productivity stuff. Let's build the stuff to slow us down.
Yeah.
Is anybody doing that?
It's a problem. I'm thinking about kind of. Okay, I'm thinking about this, right? Like some of this, I call this psychologically aware productivity or neurologically aware productivity. So productivity that's not based on speed of doing things, but on the reality of how the human brain works. Some of this stuff is creeping in. Like there is a menu somewhere, for example, in Microsoft Outlook where like the term deep work for my book, Deep Work from 2016 does show up, right? Like, so these things are out there. Focus time, deep work time, like This is something that's sort of coming up in some of these tools. But I like the way you're thinking about it. Is like, let's just go all out. Like our goal here is to give people like less context switching, be able to spend more time on things without distraction, more efficiency in how they consolidate communication. So it's not happening spread out throughout the day.
Yes.
I think it would completely change. Like another thing your tool could say is you have a couple options there. One of the options also being, here's a bunch of quick 10-minute slots that are available later today.
Yes.
That you could just discuss this and figure it out. Just click on
That's
one
my
of
office
these.
hours.
That's it. Just click on one of these right now. Okay, that doesn't work. Well, okay, what about it's going to take this long? Or like give these options for when and how can I talk about these things? Yeah, I love that idea. I mean, here, I'll tell you this. I have talked to some CEOs who recognize, like from well-known companies in this space, who recognize that there's so much money on the table in knowledge work, just in terms of the value being produced per human brain hired. There's so much money on the table because we are so bad at utilizing human brains because we keep them context switching and overloaded that there's, a $1 trillion market cap on the table. And so they know, one of the CEOs said, like figuring out how to really work with human brains and have the tools to do that's the moonshot of the 21st century. They know there's huge opportunity here, but people, they're having a hard time getting through the mindset of what matters is accessibility of information, speed of execution. And I do not think just accessibility of information and speed of execution, that's what computer processors need.
Yes.
Human brains need less information bothering them. They need less context switching. They need to be able to like focus on one thing at a time. Yeah, I agree. There's a slow suite of tools to be deployed here that are built on, we want a human brain to do what human brains do best. A company that said that is our number one ethos, like giving human brains like the best possible environment to do human brain stuff. And I do think it would look very different. It would look very different than what we're doing right now.
Yeah, I agree. Someone needs to build that. Sadly, I'm out of the game. Maybe it's your turn to go jump in.
You just taught me how terrible startups are, Kevin. That's the problem.
Oh, it is horrible.
You just scared everyone off.
Yeah, exactly. Someone will listen to this and hopefully go build it. But Cal, thank you so much, man. It's been a pleasure to hang out, to chat about this stuff, to meet you for the first time, even virtually. And I hope we get a chat again soon.
I enjoyed it. Thanks.